Welcome everyone to our virtual program. We're very excited to welcome Zara, who will be speaking about her new book. I'm going to hand this over to Abby Lua in just a moment, who will do an introduction. But before I do, if you have any questions during the program, please enter them in the Q&A and we will address them at the end of her presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Abby Lua.
Hi, everyone. I'm Abby, and I'm the assistant curator at the Michener Art Museum, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker for tonight. So tonight we have Zara Anishanslin, who is an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware, who specializes in material culture. She's the author of the award-winning book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk: Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, and has served as a historical consultant for various television programs and cultural institutions, including the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Hamilton, the Exhibition. Since 2023, she has been a postdoctoral fellow at the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Anishanslin.
Thank you so much, Abby, and thank you, Jen, for the very kind invitation to join you. I am so excited to be speaking with your audience, although audience, I'm so sorry I can't see you, but with you in spirit, and look forward to your questions, fielding them at the end. And please do, throw them in there as they come up so that the inspiration doesn't leave you. But I'm very excited as a resident of Pennsylvania, a long time. My family's been in Pennsylvania for generations, so it's especially nice to have the chance to be speaking for a Pennsylvania institution that I think so highly of. So thank you all for giving your evening to this event. So I like to start with a look at my cover because I think it's absolutely fabulous. I had nothing to do with it, so I can say that without any ego. They just presented it to me and said, "What do you think?" And I thought it was amazing. The flame and the tossing ships and the sort of sense of danger and urgency behind revolution, but also the idea that revolution is something that the fans need to be flamed, right? We need to figure out a way to get people to come together and agree on things, to do the same things at the same time, and that you need a passion behind it. And very often it's artists who inflame our passions and give us inspiration. That's why revolutions always have art and song and poems and performances. And the title of this book, in fact, is taken from a Phyllis Wheatley poem in which she references the power of the painter's and the poet's fire. And she, although I'm not going to talk about her today, really, is one of the key historical figures, one of the non-forgotten artists in my book. And so this is an homage to her. And it also is an opportunity for me to do something which is one of my hobbies, which is embarrassing my Gen Z children. Because when I got this cover image, I sent it to our family group chat and I was like, guys, isn't my cover fire? And they were like, oh, I'll never say that again. But so it's been so fun because I've had the chance to say that in front of them a few times now and watch them get duly embarrassed. So mission accomplished by this cover in a variety of ways. So I'm going to begin this story that's about the American Revolution and how art and politics coincide. But I'm kind of contrarily going to start with a piece of art that no longer exists. So I'm going to ask you all to use your imagination with me for a few minutes. And I'm not going to begin in Virginia or Philadelphia or New England or any of the places where you might think a story about the American Revolution would start. Instead, I'm going to begin in London, more precisely in London's Royal Academy of Art. So picture the scene. This is London's Royal Academy of Art, the second floor gallery, which is a 37-foot tall ceiling from floor to the top of the roof. And if you look down at the bottom, you can see, this is the advantage of webinars. You actually can see these images really well. If you look down at the bottom, you'll see the teeny tiny people sort of, dwarfed by the hundreds of paintings hanging above them. And this is in fact what it looked like in its opening night of the annual exhibition in 1780. So it was crowded with pictures hung gallery style, as you see here. And among these were new portraits of King George III and Queen Charlotte by American painter Benjamin West. And here you see the painting of Queen Charlotte that was debuted that night. So the king and queen were there themselves, partly to see their new paintings, partly because this is the Royal Academy and it was opening in its new home, and it was royal largesse that helped to finance this. People will appreciate that museums need donors, right? So the king and queen in this case were the big donors. But also among these was the debut painting by 22-year-old Joseph Wright, who was a promising, already award-winning Royal Academy student, notable for being one of the first Americans to study there. And this is his first splash on the art scene. And although his painting was just one of many in the show, it was one of the most widely remarked upon pieces that year. And so this is remarkable because if you think about how paintings come to be chosen for the Royal Academy, it's a jury, right? So you don't just pop in, decide to put your painting on the wall, and there she goes. A group of experts have to get together and decide that your painting is good enough and that it's worthy to hang in the annual show. And what his entry showed was his famous mother, who was an American, Patience Wright, who you see here in another image of her from 1775. She was an American wax sculptor, so think Madame Tussauds before Madame Tussauds was popular. And his portrait of her in the Royal Academy showed her just like this, modeling a head on her lap. She was a famous figure by the time his portrait of her went up in 1780. She operated a very popular wax museum in London. Anyone went to this. You didn't have to have a lot of money to go to it, though. And she was widely known for the way she modeled her wax heads. So if she was modeling an image of you would sit across from her and she would be modeling your face from life in wax mixed with turpentine to keep it pliable. And while she was doing it, she would be talking you up. She was very charming and very chatty. And the thing that made her famous, though, in addition to her skill at sculpture, was that she would be making the head under her skirt. And the whole time she's talking to you. And then when she felt she was done, she would pull the head out from under her skirt as if she'd just given birth to a wax sculpture of the person sitting in front of her. And as you can imagine, this created quite a sensation and more than a little suggestive that she's giving birth and a little titillating, pulling things out of your skirt in the 18th century. But so she was super famous by the time her son's portrait of her went up in 1780. I also should say that by the time her son's portrait went up, she was rumored correctly to be a spy for the American Patriots. And what she held on her lap in that Royal Academy portrait of her was a head, but it wasn't just any head. What she held was the decapitated head of King Charles I, who was England's king, famously beheaded by his own subjects during the English Civil War. And looking down on her work were busts of King George and Queen Charlotte. So this immediately was, as her son intended it to be, understood by those seeing it to be a portrait of regicide and the threat of future regicide. So it created an absolute sensation. But here what was so interesting to me when I came across references to this in the archives of the Royal Academy in London. This is 5 years into the war. This is 5 years after the Battle of Lexington and Concord initiates bloodshed between Great Britain and its former colonies. But even though it's 5 years into it and this is hanging on a wall in London with the king and queen seeing it, reactions to it varied widely. Some, of course, called it an insult to decency and treasonous and said it should be taken off the walls immediately. But other people went in newspaper, what we would call op-eds today, as well as wrote in private letters, that this was an entertaining defense of constitutional liberties, and that the Americans were in fact the ones upholding the values of things like the Magna Carta that George III and his government were trampling upon. So this to me was so fascinating. The fact that a jury of experts let it go on the annual exhibition wall at all, I think tells you a lot. And the fact that there were such clashing opinions about it 5 years into the war remind us that this war we now call the American Revolution was actually a civil war that was fought not just in North America, but on both sides of the Atlantic, by artists as well as soldiers, and in the courts of public opinion as well as on the battlefield. And I think a really striking reminder of this is the fact that after this portrait went up on the walls in May of 1780 into the Royal Academy, that same week a political cartoon was published by a woman printmaker in London, and you see that on the left, called The Heads of the Nation in a Right Situation. Patience Wright is the woman sort of in the center, and she's looking up at a bunch of decapitated heads of British ministers who have been put on a wall in London. And the same time this is happening, the siege of Charleston, which would end up, you see a map depicting that on the right, which would end up being the worst defeat for the American forces throughout the American Revolution. They're happening simultaneously. So this really is a moment that's unfolding on both sides of the Atlantic. And you have artists as well as soldiers fighting it. But art, like a lot of things, doesn't always survive the havoc of history. And what's preserved in our museums is only a little bit of what was once created and seen. The reason I've had to ask you to imagine this portrait of Patience Wright holding the decapitated head of Charles I, for example, is because it only survives in archival documentation, like letters and newspapers. The portrait itself was likely lost at sea, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. In 1781, Joseph Wright left London for Paris, probably in a little bit of political hot water because of his portrait. And then in 1782, with the help of the Wright's family friend Ben Franklin, whose portrait you see on the left, decided to return to the United States because he'd received a plum commission to create the portrait of George Washington that you see on the right, and also a sculpture that would be used for a larger statue of him that was planned by Congress. And I'll just quickly say that the George Washington on the right maybe doesn't look like the Charles Wilson Peel, Gilbert Stuart Washington that we all picture. But according to Thomas Jefferson, who owned a copy of this and it still hangs at Monticello today, Joseph Wright's portrait of George Washington was the one that was the best likeness of him. So according to his contemporaries, this actually looks more like George Washington than the ones that, are on our currency today, etc. But before he gets to America safely to paint the portrait of George Washington, Joseph Wright is sailing on the Boston-bound ship the Argo, which you see here. And the reason the Argo has a portrait done of it is that after a 10-week journey, battling gusts of snow-filled wind, on its last day at sea, the Argo approached the Maine coast and ran aground on a pile of rocks. And although the passengers managed to make it ashore, much of the ship's cargo, including Wright's paintings, including that of his mother holding the head of Charles I, was lost, washed out of the ship's hold, or sunk below the waves. But even though that portrait may have sunk under the Atlantic and is physically lost, it offers an invaluable window into the revolutionary past, and also I think a metaphor for how we can think about that past and reconstructing it. Because much as we can dive to retrieve shipwrecked things from the bottom of the sea, we can tell histories that allow us to see previously submerged stories about the past. Just because they're submerged or hidden doesn't mean they're not there. And in The Painter's Fire, what I hope to do is bring these revolutionary portraits of people and of art up from the depths of the past and into the light. And this allows us to see a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution and the creative people who made it, one that transforms the way we think of the nature of patriotism then and now. So this art and these artists are important to this story because the American Revolution wasn't just fought in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. Art is not incidental to revolution. Art is instrumental to revolution. Historians can tend to talk about art as illustrative, as, sort of illustrating the great events of revolution. And I would say that art can also inspire revolution, and very often does. And on both sides of the Atlantic, artists armed with paint, canvas, and wax risked their reputations and their lives to declare independence. And many of them are artists that most people have never heard of. I like to say that these are the most important artists who are unknown and forgotten, which isn't exactly a great selling point to a publisher, but I think is important in terms of telling a truer story of art in the Revolutionary era. And in fact, it's also because it's partly they're forgotten because of who they were. They're women. There were women everywhere in the 18th century art world, but many of them have their names have been lost, their attributions have been forgotten. These also happen to be men of color, enslaved and free, and Britons who lived in England for the entirety of the war, but nevertheless saw themselves as diehard American patriots. And so these patriot artists are not the usual suspects. They're not John Trumbull. They're not John Singleton Copley. And they are, because of who they are or where they are excluded from holding formal political or military power. And instead, they fire shots against the king on the walls of the Royal Academy and use wax museums to run international spy rings. And together, I think their experiences and their art testify to the promise and the limitations of liberty in the founding era. And in particular, I think there are three sort of central artists that I follow. Joseph Wright's mother, Patience Wright, the wax sculptor and spy. Robert Edge Pine, who's an award-winning British painter who's so fired up by the ideals of the American Revolution that once the war is done, he emigrates to America and opens America's first art museum in Philadelphia. And also Prince Demah, who is America's first identifiable enslaved portrait painter. And his work is what initially inspired me to put together this network of artists and to tell the story of these forgotten people. So when I say forgotten, forgotten is sort of loose here because I did in fact come across Prince Demah's portrait in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that is not, not like I found it in someone's attic buried or something, but forgotten in the sense that Prince Demah's work was only discovered in terms of his biography and put on the walls of the Met around 2014, 2015 when I first encountered it. And one of the reasons that I was so struck by it was that I had a group of students in the American wing at the Met. And I was asking them to look at things like, I know you're all familiar with the painting on the right. You have what I hear is a wonderful show, and I can't wait to see it. Completely inspired by people's inspirations of this painting, which of course is Lutz's famous Washington crossing the Delaware, painted in the 1850s, and I would say one of the sort of standard images of the American Revolution ever since. And I was asking my students to look at the art and see how the American Revolution had been mythologized through art. And Lutz's painting, again, I go to your show if you haven't already because it does a wonderful job with this, but it is not historically accurate. This is not what this painting is meant to do. It is meant to heroicize one of the, epic moments in the American Revolution, one of the great underdog moments of the American Revolution. And for a variety of reasons, this boat is much smaller than the boats that were used. Anyone who has ever been on a boat knows you don't stand up in a river like this when you're crossing. And then the man holding the flag behind Washington is another future president, James Monroe, who'd actually crossed the river the night before. So not historically accurate, not a revolutionary painting in the sense that it's actually chronicling, historically accurate events of the Revolution. But this is one of the things art does well, right? It heroicizes, it mythologizes. And this painting is one of the things that does that. But as my students were looking at this, I was struck by the painting on the left, which is one of three known paintings, although there might be a fourth, stay tuned, known to be painted by Prince Demah, North America's first identifiable enslaved portrait painter. And this is a relatively small painting, sort of tucked away in a corner of the American wing. And if you look at this painting, you wouldn't think this was a revolutionary painting, right? This is, sort of self-taught looking, what we used to call folk art vibe to it. This is of a Scottish merchant, William Duguid, who had settled in Boston. It was painted in 1773. He's wearing a banyan or dressing gown of Indian chintz. This symbolizes the fact that he trades in global textiles. He's got a wonderful little brooch. The brooch itself, which is red garnet, survived in the family alongside the portrait, and you could see it at the Met at this time too. And this shows the cleverness of the artist because he's sending all of these messages about this man through this portrait, including the fact that he's Scottish, because that brooch itself is a witch's heart or Lukenbooth, which is a symbol of Scottishness. So this is all fine, right? 18th century art's very symbolic. None of this is earth-shattering. But when you consider that the man who painted this, who signed it on the back, was enslaved at the time that he painted it, and that he had very improbably just returned from London where he had trained with an award-winning British painter. This is not something that usually happens to enslaved artists. And then returns to America. And then when his loyalist enslavers leave the country because of the political crisis in 1775, is self-emancipated and enlists to fight for the Patriots, fights for the Massachusetts militia. You realize that this is a revolutionary portrait in every sense of the word. It is done by a revolutionary artist, done by this man with this, film-like story of patriotism. And thinking about the networks of people involved in his life, led me to think that this could be a really fascinating way to look at these artists who at the time were very important and famous in their own right. And Patience Wright, for example, was much more famous on both sides of the Atlantic than John Trumbull. But that hasn't come down in time, right? That's not how we remember this. So this is sort of the vision that began the book. And along the way, these people are deeply connected to famous people. So Ben Franklin, Paul Revere, Thomas Jefferson, John and Abigail Adams, George and Martha Washington, Phyllis Wheatley. They're all part of this book. They're all connected to these artists who are so passionately devoted to the American cause. And it gives us a new transatlantic history of the American Revolution through its art and its creative visionaries. That is, I think, much like artists themselves. It's fascinating, it's creative, it's bizarre, it's not always logical, and it is sometimes, I will dare say, even wackadoodle. So I'm going to start a little bit with sort of showing you some representative examples of their art. On the left, you see Prince Demah's portrait of his enslaver, Christian Barnes. She was the one who, with the encouragement of Prince's mother, Daphne, who was enslaved in her household as a cook, became encouraged to really back his potential as a professional portrait painter in Boston. Now, there are lots of enslaved people doing skilled labor, working in artisan shops, working with printmakers, with silversmiths, etc. But this is someone who is encouraged by his enslaver to go and train in London because she asked John Singleton Copley if he would train him in Boston, and he refused to because of his race. But so what he ended up doing was going to London and training with the man who painted the portrait of George II in the middle, Robert Edge Pine. And I often wonder about their political exchanges because, as time would tell, they both end up patriots, which is interesting. So it's sort of a chicken and egg question about who influenced whom in this case, whether it was the British painter training the enslaved man from Boston or the enslaved man from Boston influencing the British painter to tilt towards the cause of liberty. And then on the right, you see the sole surviving life-size wax sculpture done by Patience Wright, whose portrait opened this talk. And this is a portrait that you can go see in Westminster Abbey. This is William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who was a British prime minister who spoke up and tried to ameliorate things with the American War, as they called the Revolution in England. And this, I think, gives you a hint of how important she was in London at the time, because she was commissioned to make this after he gave an impassioned speech in the House of Lords and collapsed and died. And he's wearing the robes, actually, in which he collapsed and died in this wax sculpture. But you don't get asked to make a death effigy to stay for posterity in Westminster Abbey unless you're very deeply respected. So even though she's known to be an American spy, she's still given this commission, which I think speaks to how much she's respected as an artist, even though wax makers then as now are not seen as being quite as serious as people who work in paint, right? This is an interesting hierarchy within art. But so if we think about Prince Demah and his life, I think we get a sense of someone who is inspired to paint because it's his passion. He's widely regarded as a genius. He takes out newspaper advertisements that he himself has been trained by one of the best masters in London and that he's a genius. And he's seen this way because he has been born into slavery in Massachusetts, and was sold away from his mother very young, not long after Henry Barnes married his wife, Christian. And this is something that, speaks to the sad reality of slavery dividing families, but he and his mother managed to get back together and get him this professional training, which is astounding. And the person that he trained with in London, as I mentioned, was an award-winning painter who ends up emigrating to America after the American Revolution. But he's already won multiple prizes with the Society of the Artists. He's exhibited multiple times at the Royal Academy. I also think, and people at the time thought as well, that even though there's no documentary evidence for this, he came from a family that was of African descent as well. And his father, John Pine, on the right, you can see, painted by his friend William Hogarth, with a pearl earring that was used in 18th century art to show African heritage. And this, I think, was one of the reasons that he was excited to train Prince Demah, because they did share this heritage of African descent. And if you think about the painting they were working on together while Prince Demah was training with Robert Edge Pine, I think it speaks to their political connection even as early as 1771 when this painting was being done, because Prince Demah would have been trained by Pine to work on painting the background and work on painting the textiles like the drapery on the table, while Robert Edge Pine would have done the faces. And I always wonder what they talk about while they did this, because this is a scene from 14th century English history showing the Earl of Warenne with his sword drawn, confronting King Edward because King Edward has unjustly and tyrannically seized his property without proper procedure. So the idea of what a tyrannical king might do to your property in 1771 is obviously something that people are getting fired up about on both sides of the Atlantic, and this will be one of the things that helps to launch us into revolution. And so it's interesting to think about this man who ends up enlisting to fight for the Patriots, and his teacher who ends up emigrating to found an art museum to celebrate the American Revolution, working on this painting as early as 1771 and talking about politics as well as brushstrokes. And then I do think, this is the one thing I'm going to say about Phillis Wheatley, I do think, and I'm happy to answer a question about this in the Q&A, I think it was Prince Demah who painted Phillis Wheatley's portrait that then became copied into this frontispiece that's in the front of her book of published poems. And again, I can go into that in the Q&A. A lot of reasons, documentary and aesthetic, that I think that. But I think this is one of his paintings that he's not been given credit for. And I also think it's a reminder that he's not a Black genius operating in a vacuum. He has set up shop just, 2 blocks or so from where Phillis Wheatley is living, enslaved in Boston. And the two of them are widely acknowledged on both sides of the Atlantic to be creative geniuses, and they're neighbors. And I think that that's a wonderful reminder that Black people who are extraordinary artistic geniuses they're extraordinary, but they're not unique in this time period. And then I also think that Prince Demah's art is a reminder of the violence that is at the heart of the American Revolution, a violence that we often pretty much shove to one side and think about, British and loyalists and the patriots are the good guys. And I think that is helped by art from the start. So everyone, I think, looking at this will know what's on the left. It's Paul Revere's famous Boston Massacre print, in which he shows the British lined up firing squad style, firing into the crowd of unarmed, well-dressed men and boys. We all know this is not how this went down. But this is such a successful bit of visual propaganda that when accounts of the Boston Massacre and its trial are published in book format, British authorities try to destroy all the copies that have this as the frontispiece, because they know that this art sends a powerful message, and they want that message to be stopped. But I also think that if we look at the portrait on the right, even though this just looks like a genteel, well-off colonial elite woman, and this is probably a copy of a Copley that Prince Demah made, it also is a reminder of the violence that is at the heart of the American revolutionary experiment, a violence that art helps to inspire and foment and chronicle. Because if you're looking at her chest and you're wondering what's wrong with it, what's wrong with it is that the bayonet was stabbed through the heart of the portrait. Because when Christian Barnes and her husband Henry, after years of threats for being loyalists, for being loyal to king and crown, including a moment in which an effigy was hung on a hill across from their house in Massachusetts with a label saying that it was Henry Barnes, and then burned at night. And then later that night, another effigy was put onto a horse that had been stolen from a nearby stable before being, with a sign on it, wishing the Barneses all in hell. Before the horse, the effigy, saddle, bridle, all were tarred and feathered, which is the only example we know of an animal being tarred and feathered in the American Revolution. After things like that were protesting against the fact that the Barneses continued to sell British goods despite boycotts against them in the wake of the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties, they eventually flee their home in Massachusetts, leaving all of their property behind, including their portraits by Prince Demah. And when patriots come to confiscate the house and all their property and all its contents, they stab a bayonet through the heart of the portraits to send one final political message. So these portraits, I think, are a reminder of the really, the violent undercurrent that is running throughout the American Revolution, and that is not confined to battlefields, right? This is someone's private home where this is happening. So when the Barneses flee the country, I think I probably would too if a horse was tarred and feathered to send me a message. It's pretty violent. They flee the country, and Prince Demah and his mother are sort of de facto emancipated because they stay behind. And he ends up not just continuing to paint portraits professionally, but he also enlists to fight in the Massachusetts militia known as the Train. It's an artillery unit, and he worked as a matros, which is the person who sort of shoves the materials into the cannon before it's lit to be fired. And this was a unit in which Paul Revere was the second in command. There were lots of other artisans, and Paul Revere, of course, you see on the right in his Copley portrait. And I love this too because his military records show us that when he enlisted to fight, he enlists as Prince Demah, and he drops the Barnes. So Demah was either his mother's surname in West Africa where she was born, or it was her Muslim first name. We don't know which, but she made sure that her son was given that name, which is highly unusual for enslaved people at the time. And I love that he drops the Barnes as soon as the Barneses leave America. And I think you can sort of see this sort of coming, a hint of this coming in how he signed that portrait of William Duguid that I showed you from the Met, because it's a big prince, a big Demah, and a little tiny Barnes. And he drops that Barnes as soon as he can. So sadly, he dies in 1778, undoubtedly with many more paintings left inside him that will never come to fruition. And I love, though, that when he dies, he chooses in his will to remember himself as a painter and a free man. So those were the two things that meant the most to him. So I do always wonder if he corresponded with his London teacher, Robert Edge Pine, in the years that he was painting portraits and fighting for the patriot cause, because they certainly shared political points of view. And you see this with Robert Edge Pine's art before the war. So he painted the great radical British revolutionaries like John Wilkes. His portrait of him, which you see in the top right, is one of the most flattering portraits of John Wilkes. John Wilkes was, despite being a very successful womanizer, renowned for being super ugly. And Robert Edge Pine really puts the lipstick on the pig here. He really makes him look much more attractive than other portraits of him look. And I think it's because he sympathized with his politics. And whether people in America knew it or not, when they looked at prints that were made of John Wilkes that circulated around the British Empire, this image even gets put on a snuff box, which you see at the bottom center there. So you could take a pinch of tobacco and think about Wilkes and liberty, I guess. When Americans, as well as Britons, looked at this image celebrating John Wilkes, they saw the art of Robert Edge Pine. So he was helping through his art to popularize the sort of radical British politics that people like the Sons of Liberty were aligning themselves with in the lead up to the American Revolution. He also was painting what were seen as very incendiary political paintings, despite being in Britain. What you see on the left is his 1778 painting that became made into a print, which means it's, widely available, easily reproduced, economically accessible. And in this painting, you see America bringing the blessings of liberty and peace and prosperity to a world that's been decimated by Britain. Now, if you're living in Britain at the time, there's a Treason Act in place. This art is very incendiary, and Robert Edge Pine does claim that his business suffers for it and that he feels somewhat ostracized. And so one of the things that happens is that he does up and leave and go to America, and more on that in a bit. But before he leaves, he paints a portrait of his good friend, Patience Wright, the wax sculptor. And here on the left, you see his portrait of Patience Wright, which is at the National Portrait Gallery in DC. And I love this portrait because I think it's a beautiful portrait, but she has this sort of lump under her of something under the diaphanous folds on top of her lap. So I think it's a hint to the scandalous way she created those wax heads under her skirts. And a reminder that these artists were operating in this, she's working as a spy, he's creating incendiary art, she's also creating incendiary art in her wax museum. And even though they're in England, they are constantly fighting for the rights of American prisoners of war who were retained in England. She is also spying. She made a point when the war began to write to her friends like John Dickinson and Benjamin Franklin and say, women are always useful in grand events. I want to be put to work. Let me help the cause. And I think it's a great reminder that, again, she's extraordinary but not unique. So we like to talk about Abigail Adams saying, remember the ladies. Abigail Adams is not the only one asking for women to have more of a voice and have more rights given to them in this new Republican experiment. Patience Wright is also doing this. And one of the ways she's doing this is through espionage. So she would listen to gossip of in her wax museum. She had the ear of the great and powerful in England. Lord Dunmore, who was the last royal governor of Virginia, knew her from when they both lived in New York City, and he dropped by her wax museum to try to change her mind about politics, which is kind of amazing, right? He's got a lot of other things he could do. And so she takes all this information that she's gathering from gossip and the informational network she's part of, and some of it she ships across the channel to Benjamin Franklin in France. And some of it she writes in letters that she puts in wax heads that she ships across the Atlantic to her sister, who's operating a wax museum in Philadelphia, not far from Continental Congress. And I don't know how wonderful her espionage skills were, because there are letters in the British Library from the sort of 18th century version of British MI6 saying, "We found another letter from Patience Wright to Franklin. It's not great information though, so we're going to let this one go through because it might actually do our side more good than harm to let her information go." But I think the information she sent to her sister was more useful because it often got there faster and was more reliable in terms of who sent it than some of the things that would come in things like newspapers. And so Patience Wright, very sadly, had plans, big plans, to go back to America after the war. She wanted to, and I so wish this had happened, she wanted to go back and create a gallery of wax figures of the founders that would have been in Independence Hall. And if you can imagine walking into Independence Hall today and seeing a Madame Tussauds of the founders, that would have been amazing. I so regret that didn't happen. But sadly, she died. She tripped and fell on making her way home from a visit to John and Abigail Adams' home in England. They were in London then, as he was the first ambassador from America after the war to Great Britain. And she'd gone there because she was trying once again to convince him to fund her trip back home to create this wax gallery. And I always wonder if she was a little upset after her visit, because not only did he not fund her, but Abigail Adams was not a fan. She once called her the Queen of Sluts. And I'm happy to elaborate on that in the Q&A as well. So at the time of her death, her friend Robert Edgepine had made it to America. He was first invited to go to Mount Vernon, where Martha Washington had him stay for 3 weeks. He painted portraits of 4 of her grandchildren. They're still hanging today in the Washington's bedroom, if you've been to Mount Vernon. Painted the portrait of her niece, Fanny, which is the portrait on the top left, right in the front parlor, which is the image on the right with the blue furniture. And he also painted this picture of George Washington, which is another one that is widely regarded by Washington's contemporaries to be a very accurate depiction of him. So this is Washington after the war ended. This doesn't look like marble-jawed, heroic George Washington. This is not Lutz's Washington crossing the Delaware, right? This is the Washington who, in the famous episode in Newburgh, New York, went to read some remarks to the soldiers and said, "Excuse me while I get out my spectacles. I've grown old and nearly blind in the service of my country." This is that Washington. And I love this because to me this shows the Washington who has suffered through the toils and cares of leadership and war, and has gotten a little old and haggard in the process, right? So something to think about, because to me this sort of humanizes George Washington. And again, the Washington crossing the Delaware, that's a mythic hero. This is the man who grew old and nearly blind in the service of his country. And I think thinking about both those images is so important and very cool, and shows us the many different things that art can do. So at the time, again, if you look at Robert Edgepine's paintings, they don't look like how we picture American Revolutionary art, because we, again, filter it through this 19th century lens. We also filter it through a sort of, very chiseled Charles Wilson Peele, John Trumbull, again, which continue into the 19th century lens. But if you look at the portrait on the left, which is Martha Washington's granddaughter, Nellie Parke Custis, it's a lovely painting, but it doesn't look like what we think of as revolutionary art. But at the time, Robert Edgepine was a much more important artist than John Trumbull, much more important than Charles Wilson Peele, and the Washingtons recognized that. That's one of the reasons they had him come and stay at Mount Vernon before he took off for Philadelphia. And if you look at what Martha Washington had, she was a real connoisseur, by the way. And if you look at the only other image she had of her progeny before this, it's John Wollaston's 1750s portrait of her children on the right, which really looked like sort of feral children who might be in some kind of, Spielberg horror film. So if you think about that, if that's the only thing you have is like an itinerant colonial painter who's not that great, and then all of a sudden you have an award-winning British artist, classically trained, who can come and create a non-feral portrait of your grandchildren, you can sort of start to understand the appeal. And so Robert Edgepine was phenomenally prolific when he was in America, even though he only lived for about 5 years after he emigrated. And one of the reasons he was so prolific is that his daughters, at least three of the five of them, were also artists. Some of them would go on to exhibit at the Royal Academy themselves. Here you see his daughter Charlotte, who was one of those artist daughters. And really, every single painting by Robert Edgepine in America should say that it's done by Robert Edgepine and daughters, because they had this bizarre assembly line way of making the art, which this is not a usual technique. What they would do is Robert Edgepine would go and meet with the person in life. So here you see his portrait of Robert Morris, the financier of the American Revolution. So he went and met with Robert Morris, painted his face from life, and then cut it out on a smaller piece of canvas that he then glued to a larger piece, and his daughters finished out the face and the background. And if you look at the portrait of Robert Morris, you can see the sort of halo effect around his head. That is where the canvas is glued to the larger canvas. And it's fantastic because in examples of people who aren't as important as Robert Morris, historically speaking, where the paintings haven't been conserved as well, sometimes you can see the little canvas head is really popping off the back of the canvas, and it's amazing. So this is another great example, I think, though, of the fact that women artists are everywhere in the 18th century, but a lot of times their names are not acknowledged to be part of it. But this is a painting that's done equally by his daughters as well as by him. And the reason that I'm showing you Robert Morris is that Robert Morris is so taken with the art of Robert Edgepine that he builds him a mansion in Philadelphia. And the entire second floor is an art museum, an open gallery, and it's filled with hundreds of paintings. It's filled with, very scandalously, because she's nude, the first copy of the Venus de Milo anyone has ever seen. When the French sculptor Houdon brings his famous bust of Benjamin Franklin to America, the bust that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art today, he leaves it at Robert Edgepine's museum so that people can pay to come and see it. And this is a museum that most Americans have no idea ever existed. And it predated Charles Willson Peale's American Museum. And it doesn't survive. The building doesn't survive. And again, I can tell you in the questions a little bit about why the art doesn't survive. But I will allow one of Charles Willson Peale's children, Rembrandt, to tell you in his own words how amazing it was compared to what Charles Willson Peale had at the time, which was a sort of natural history / portrait in a few rooms of the family's townhouse. And Rembrandt said, "When I entered Mr. Pine's spacious salon, I was astonished at its magnitude and the richness of the paintings which covered its walls." So it had things like, you see here, The Fate of Ophelia, which is one of Robert Edgepine's massive paintings showing a scene from a Shakespearean play. And if you think about the image that I showed you at the beginning of the Royal Academy, this is more what Robert Edgepine's museum looked like. Colonial America had never seen anything like this. And until Robert Edgepine died, and then eventually the museum moved from Philadelphia to Boston, and then sadly went up in flames, which is why I'm showing you prints instead of paintings. Luckily, the prints retained the art, but most of the paintings went up into fire in the 19th century. This is how a lot of Americans got their sense of what art was. And we don't have a good sense of that because none of it survived. One thing that does survive is one of his massive history paintings that he was doing to chronicle the great events of the American Revolution. And this is called Congress Voting Independence. And those of you who've been to Independence Hall will see this is a faithful replica of the architectural interior. The same Windsor chairs you can go see today. Very plain, no curtains on the walls, just blinds. And if you look at the figures, I think this is a pretty, accurate reflection of what it was like after hours of, haranguing and debating. And poor Benjamin Franklin in the middle there with his head on his hand, has terrible posture and looks ready to, fall asleep. And Robert Morris, who is the man sitting next to the table on the left, has quite a noticeable pot belly. And, a lot of men just are not looking their best, right? And this is really a sort of almost what we would think of as journalistic capturing. This is not heroicized. This is more like a, photorealism before it exists. And if you think about what it becomes, which is the basis for John Trumbull's famous version of it, Congress Voting Independence, which is in the Capitol Rotunda, the 19th century painting on the right, you will see that Trumbull took the concept, ran with it, photoshopped it, put some filters on it, because the ceiling has gotten higher. There are velvet curtains on the walls. There's a rug on the floor, velvet upholstered armchairs, and every single man has amazing posture, not a pot belly in sight, and they all have really lovely, well-turned calves. So this again, to sort of compare and contrast the Prince Demah portrait and the Lutza crossing the Delaware at the beginning, and to compare and contrast Robert Edge Pine with John Trumbull at the end. These are all paintings that are doing different things, and they're all doing wonderful things. Trumbull, like Lutza, is heroicizing and mythologizing the great moments of the American Revolution. Prince Demah is capturing the everyday people who are part of it, whether they are, people who are patriots or loyalists whose lives are changed forever by just existing in that time period. And Robert Edge Pine is, capturing these moments in a much more sort of realistic way. And I think that it's wonderful to think about how our understanding of the revolution and what it looked like would have been altered had more of Robert Edge Pine's art survived, had more of Prince Demah's art been identifiable, and had Patience Wright had her way to create the Wax Founders Museum to rival Madame Tussauds in Independence Hall. Their art would have created a very different visual memory of the American Revolution. And I think that as we are, in this year of the 250th, we need to think about what's in museums. We also need to think about what's not in museums. But this is about more than art. This is about people who were patriots as well as creative people. And the intertwined lives of these patriots in this book reminds us that Revolutionary era patriotism and artistry was cosmopolitan, it was geographically broad, it was transatlantic, and it was diverse. There were women as well as men engaged in this artistic experiment in these patriot politics. There were Black and mixed race people, enslaved and free, and people from outside what became the boundaries of the United States. People who practiced idiosyncratic but highly effective visual propaganda and politics through art and popular culture, and sometimes some well-placed espionage. And so I hope that as we think about our nation, where we've been, where we're going, that the artists in this book remind us that we should continue to come together and think about what art can do for us then and now, and have conversations about what this era looked like in all its glorious complexity, and what's been mythologized, what hasn't been mythologized, and how that can inspire conversations that we have about where we're going today and in the future. So thank you so much for sharing your time with these forgotten artists, patriots, and I look forward to having a bit of a chat. And if anyone does not have a chance to have a question answered, or just didn't come up with one till later, please feel free to email me and reach out. I'm happy to be in conversation. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anishanslin, for such a wonderful presentation. As we're waiting for questions to populate, I had a quick question that I wanted to kick
Yes.
off. I was curious with the Christian Barnes portrait that had the bayonet tear. I was curious,
Mhm.
what is the provenance of that painting? Like, is that a current photograph that you use, and does the current institution maintain that tear?
Yes, so it is at the Hingham Historical Society, as is the portrait of her husband, Henry, which also has a bayonet mark, but it's not as noticeable. And I think hers is really noticeable because it's on wood, and so it's sort of gouged in. But so the family, they left their paintings behind because, they fled sort of in terror. And And initially they had a cousin in their house and who wasn't a loyalist. And if you had a relative who was able to sign an oath of loyalty to, America, your stuff was supposed to not be confiscated, but their stuff was confiscated anyway. And one of the reasons Daphne and Prince were left behind was in the hopes that they also could help to save some of the property. And so the Barneses just never got their things back. Henry Knox and his wife Lucy were given the house and all its contents, which really upset Christian Barnes because she and Lucy had been friends since childhood, and she thought it was very rude that she was using all her things and playing her harpsichord and looking at her portraits. And so the paintings though ended up sort of with the provenance of Barnes family members who didn't flee the country. And then those family members ended up staying in Hingham, Massachusetts. That's how they made it to the Hingham Historical Society. So for years, they were just seen as these, interesting portraits with, weird marks on them. And then a woman who's on the board of the Hingham Historical Society did a lot of research and figured out that they were Prince Demah. And so then, off and running since then. But it is fascinating because they have a really unbroken provenance in terms of their place in Massachusetts. And I'm convinced that there are many other pieces of art like this in Massachusetts and other places that were just not seen as, that good, or they weren't a famous artist. And so, things come out for auction all the time, which is amazing. So who knows what's out there?
Yeah, and I'm just amazed that it stayed pretty local. It didn't really go too
Hmm.
far either. So we have a few questions that have come in. So the first is, what was the general Philadelphian public reaction to the Robert Edge Pine Museum? Do we know why the Robert Edge Pine Museum was moved from Philadelphia to Boston? And does a complete list of all works at his museum survive?
Yes, so people loved it. I think Rembrandt Peale is, a good sort of taste of that, because he's training to be an artist and he's just super enamored of it. And obviously, Robert Morris, is enough behind it that he builds an entire mansion to house it. So amazing. And when Robert Edge Pine dies, his wife and daughters keep operating it for a while. And I think, again, it gives you an indication of how important they were at the time, even though they've since been largely forgotten. Because in addition to operating the museum, they ran a school for young ladies. And among their pupils were Martha Washington's granddaughter, Thomas Jefferson's younger daughter, and Benjamin Franklin's granddaughters. So, these men are not sending those girls to a school of someone they don't respect. So, kind of a good reminder that it is very well received by, the elite of early Republican America, but also it's popular. You don't have to pay that much money to go in and see it. And we know that thousands of people do go see it. We also know exactly what was in it because there's a catalog, and there also is an inventory done when Robert Edge Pine dies. And so there's a whole list of, what you can see, and it's fascinating. And the reason it moves from Philadelphia to Boston is that when Robert Edge Pine dies, the Pennsylvania state legislature they want to keep the museum intact and in Philadelphia because they see it as sort of the beginning of what we now have as the Smithsonian, right? They see it as the beginning of like a national art collection. And they just can't raise the funds to keep it there long term. They end up selling it intact, though, to a man who's starting museums in early America named Daniel Bowen. And he, weirdly, also buys the contents of Patience Wright's daughter, Elizabeth, who has come to America and opened a wax museum in New York and has a lot of her mother's wax sculptures. He buys the contents of her wax museum. So the Wright family's wax figures and the Pine family's paintings end up in the same museum because they're first in Philadelphia and then he relocates them to Boston. And then in Boston, they all go up in flames together. So that is why I was able to show you so little of the wax figures and the actual paintings done by Robert Edge Pine, the history paintings. There are lots of his portraits that survive because, they were in individual people's homes. But yeah, it's kind of amazing because, it's like if there was a Smithsonian for 15 years that no one had ever heard of, but was super popular and millions of people went to, right? It's a crazy sort of gap in common knowledge about early American art.
And I feel like between that and the would-be wax gallery in Independence Hall, my goodness, what a trove of early US art. I
And
think we
weird
have
art. Yeah, just
weird
weird
art.
stuff too. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we have one time for one more question. And so Laura asks, first she says, "Thank you, Zara, for this presentation. I'm curious about your process in selecting your subjects for this project. How did you focus on these three artists specifically? Did you start with one artist first? And are there other quote unquote revolutionary artists you considered including?"
Yes, so I started with Prince Demah and Robert Edge Pine because that was an easy connection because Robert Edge Pine trained Prince Demah, and I loved the fact I do transatlantic history and art, and I loved the fact that there's this back and forth connection with an enslaved man from Boston going to train in London, which is highly idiosyncratic, and then a British award-winning artist being so enamored by the American Revolution that he relocates to Philadelphia, which is also unusual. Usually, artists who want to make it big want to go to Britain, not the other way around, right? This is why Benjamin West is in London, not in Philadelphia. Um, but Robert Edge Pine does the opposite. So I loved their story, and then I always, though, need their. This was before I knew about Pine's daughters being so integral to this project. But women are half of history, but we're not always half of history with capital H. And so I always like to make sure that women are represented in narratives about the past, just as they're represented in the actual past. And so I really wanted to include a woman artist. And Patience Wright is just so irresistibly odd and fascinating. And then once I realized that she and her family are deeply connected with the family of Robert Edge Pine, and they're all in the same artistic circles. So just as one example, when her younger daughter, Phoebe, marries a British painter, who's rumored, by the way, to be the illegitimate son of George III, when she marries him, there are two witnesses to the wedding, and one of them is Robert Edge Pine's niece. So that gives you an indication of how tightly connected they are. But they're all part of this, small but mighty group of artists operating in Britain throughout the American Revolution who are aiding the American cause in every way they know how, even though they're, under the king's nose, as it were. So, a fascinating group of people to look at.
Well, thank you so much. I think, yeah, Jen, do you want to wrap things up or?
Sure. Thank you, Zara. Thank you, everyone. I have written down the last three questions and I will send them to you, Zara, so
Okay,
you
great.
can answer them. They're great ones, of course. I just think we ran out of time. So, um, thank you again. You can buy her book. It's actually available at the Doylestown Bookshop, and you can pick up a copy there.
Excellent. Thank
Yeah.
you. And if you do buy it, since this is, not an in-person thing, I'm happy, reach out to me and I'm happy to send you a signed book plate so you can it can almost be like we were together in real life.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. I might have to reach out, get one for my book.
I'd be happy to. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Jen and Abby. It's so good to see you both. And thank all of you for coming. It was an honor to get to present this. And I'm so excited to come and see, Washington crossing the Delaware times 55 or however many pieces you have in the show.
Yes, please do, and let us know when you come up. We'd love to show you around. So,
Yes, thank you so much. Have a
thank
great
you,
night, everybody.
everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.